Welcome to the Renk Seeds of Innovation podcast, where tradition meets technology to help you make the most of every acre. I'm your host, Alex Renk, and whether you're listening in the cab, at the shop, or out scouting fields, we're here to bring you timely, relevant insights straight from the field. This podcast was created for farmers like you, people who are always looking for ways to improve, innovate, and stay one step ahead. In each episode, we can tap into expert knowledge, explore cutting-edge agronomy, and share practical strategies you can use to grow smarter. Today's episode is all about maximizing your soybean yield. I'm sitting down with Alex Renk, our head of soybean selection and genetics, to dig into the details on everything from managing micronutrients and selecting the right seed, all the way to planting depth, disease resistance, and even some of the more unconventional tactics farmers are using to push yield potential. If you've ever asked yourself what's limiting your soybean crop, or what you could do to unlock a few more bushels, this is the episode for you. Let's dig in. Joining us today is Alex Renk, and we're here to talk about maximizing your soybean yield. Alex, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
So I'm Alex Renk. I've been in charge of our soybeans since 1990, which involves variety selection, and I'm also kind of our IT guy at Renk Seed, so I'm also heavily involved in all our database analysis that involves soybeans and corn for that matter.
Awesome. Well, let's start with the big picture. I guess, what do you think is important to know about soybeans?
Well, it's kind of two things when you want to maximize yield. One is getting the right environment set up to start with. And then after that, probably the more important or equally important issue is what are things going to rob yield from your soybeans? It's not so much adding things that are going to add yield. It's making sure that the things that are going to rob yield are taken care of.
Fair enough. Well, then on that note, what we're going to do is we're going to start small and then we'll work our way bigger. So for robbing yield, let's talk about our micronutrients and the elements that we care about in the soil.
Okay. So probably the two big ones are going to be the P and K levels. And again, this comes back to having good tests, soil sample tests, so you know what you have to start with. But P and K are huge. Soybeans use a lot of those. Nitrogen, we don't care so much about. Nitrogen is more, if you remember from chemistry, which is starting to get really shady for me, but the atmosphere itself is made up of 78% nitrogen. So it'd be really swell if those plants could somehow take that nitrogen from the air and convert that and use that in the plant. And fortunately, with soybeans and some other of the legumes, they can have bacteria colonize their roots and take those bacteria will feed off that nitrogen and make that available for the plant.
And that hence it being a nitrogen-fixing plant, correct?
Yeah, nitrogen-fixing bacteria, of course. Yeah.
Got it.
So, that's kind of awesome because, nitrogen is expensive. You don't want to spend money on fertilizer if you don't have to. The only time you really have to worry about nitrogen is if it's super abundant. And if that's the case, then you have to worry about that nitrogen will be there. It can suppress the bacteria colonizing on those roots. And all of a sudden you're come later in the season and you're out of nitrogen because you used up the nitrogen in the soil, and then the bacteria is not there to fix more nitrogen when you need it. But that's super high levels.
Let's bring it back a little bit. Let's talk about P and K a little bit more.
Okay. Phosphorus and potassium are the two major elements. Usually nitrogen, of course, is also a major element, but we're getting that from the air. Phosphorus is really important for root development, among other things. And then potassium is kind of associated a little bit more with the flower and reproduction. But again, they both play major roles in the health of the plant, water uptake, water regulation. So having those there is very important. After that, the only thing that, only major thing I think we need to talk about is sulfur. And in the old days, we had what was called acid rain, which of course has a very negative connotation. It was a lot of sulfur and other pollutants being spewed by the, for energy production through the power plants. That had a very positive role for sulfur being applied, coming through that system through rain and settlement had a really strong effect on on fields. And sulfur is a very key ingredient for soybeans. And, having sulfur versus not having sulfur is usually about a 4 bushel difference if you don't have enough sulfur. So the only problem with sulfur is that when you apply it, it's going to take a couple years for that to be available for the plant. So you can't apply sulfur the same year and expect to get a response from those soybeans. You're really looking at sulfur from the prior year. So if your sulfur is low in your plant testing or soil testing, make sure that you apply it and then know that it's going to take some time. After that, every now and then you'll see some micronutrient that you don't have enough of. And then we'll talk about an example of that later on.
Perfect. Thanks. Now that we kind of covered our bases with the micronutrients in our soil, let's talk about seed selection as well as between varieties and genetics there and what you have to offer us there.
Okay. So when we added soybeans to our lineup, Wisconsin was kind of late to the game, the state that we're headquartered in, but it was still 1990. State average was 40 bushels per acre. Even back then, to me, that was really poor. I think we could do better. But, time has moved on. And since then, now we're commonly hitting 70s, 80s, 90s, 100s is now in sight. And so soybean genetics have come a long ways. Variety selection does make a difference. It does make a huge difference. And from just a genetic yield standpoint. The other factor is that there's a lot of things that good seed selection can help control. And there's a few major diseases that I would say use your seed as your primary tool for controlling those issues.
Could you give us some examples there?
Yeah. So iron deficiency chlorosis, which is more like a western Minnesota problem. It gets into Iowa, it gets into the Dakotas. But high iron content restricts how much the nutrients a plant can take up. So if you have a variety that can't handle that, it will restrict how much nutrients you are, and then you're going to lose yield that way. Having a variety that handles IDC is really the only economical way to control it. Otherwise, if you don't have that, you have to put so many nutrients, so much fertilizer on there to offset that. It's just not economically viable. So there's a prime example of having an IDC tolerant bean in IDC areas is the way to go as far as your variety selection. The other big one, I think, is white mold. There's no white mold gene per se for soybeans, but there is varieties, get rated for their tolerance. And that can be huge. Based on variety selection, you're going to cost yourself 15 to 20 bushel yield just by not using the white mold variety that you could have used and planted another probably, as high yielding variety, but, white mold came along and you got smacked. Brown stem rot is a resistance gene that can be in soybeans. And so as you guys get into the Michigan, more Wisconsin area, that one's kind of a silent killer. It comes late. You don't necessarily see it per se. You have to look pretty hard to find it. But if it's there, it's robbing yield. So here you got a soybean variety that has resistant. You don't have to worry about it. The last one is probably the big one is your cyst nematode genetics. And so we've started getting some material in that has the Peking gene in now. And in the past, that has been not a positive because the Peking and brown stem didn't get along together. And there was some yield drag. Now we're seeing some Peking that actually get along with brown stem rot resistance, which is good. And then also the genetics have worked around the Peking being such a drag on yield. Peking should handle the cyst nematode population better. It's not going to be forever because you're still going to have to rotate with the older genes.
Okay. So while we're still talking about seeds, let's talk about treatment for seed and what that provides for us.
Okay. So treatment for us usually has probably 2 or 3 components. Our base package, we call it the vendor package, has fungicide, insecticide, and also has the inoculant, which will be the bacterial fixing.
For nitrogen?
Yeah, for nitrogen will be added to the seed.
Got it.
Now, theoretically, you should have some of that bacteria already in the soil. But if you haven't planted soybeans on a piece of ground for a while, the natural population is not going to be strong and you're going to suffer. Also, if you get too wet, too dry, that population, the natural population will again suffer. So having that added to the seed is I think it's a very key thing to do every year. It's just safety. Again, we're talking about limiting yield robbers. So why risk not having that on there? And then the fungicides take care of a lot of the early season diseases. It's like Fusarium, Pythium, Phytophthora. And then the insecticide will take care of some early season bugs like corn leaf beetles or soybean leaf beetles, seed corn maggots, some of the more minor insect pressure. But if it's there, if you're in heavily manured soil, that's probably going to be a plus for having an insecticide on there. We also have another package that handles SDS, sudden death syndrome, and that uses Saltro, which helps protect soybeans from that problem.
Awesome. Well, thank you there. And then I guess now that we've kind of covered our seed and soil, let's go into the planting techniques and the importance there. Let's start with planting depth and the planting window that we're shooting for.
All right. Again, this is the part of the equation where it's like having a good environment for your soybeans is important. You have to have that base. We talked about having that soil, having the right amount of nutrients. Now, what do we want? How do we want to handle the planting so that things go well and things can thrive? When we started, we used to use the drill. And that drill is, my cousin has dubbed it the controlled spill. And the problem with the drill was that some seed was too deep, some seed was too shallow, and then who knows placement-wise where those beans were ending up. Some were clumped together, some were spread out. So, the problem with drills is mostly they're an older technology. People don't buy new drills, it seems. And maybe the new drills are better, but I'm still thinking the planter is the way to go when it comes to planting soybeans. The nice thing about planters is that they put it at a very consistent depth, and they should be planting at a very consistent gap or spacing. And I don't like to plant soybeans more than 1.5 inches. And I'm kind of more on the conservative side, is like 3/4 of an inch is kind of the depth I want to see. When they're too deep, they have to push that whole seed up for them to emerge. So if they're too deep and you're pushing a big seed up, it can run out of gas and not emerge. Well, it can't have a yield when it doesn't emerge. I want to get those beans up and out of the ground. Once they're up, they start growing. The longer they have to grow, the more potential yield they can have, because a soybean plant puts on a new node every certain amount of days. And those nodes are where the pods are set. If you have more nodes, you potentially have more yield. So that's important. And then population. So population-wise, university data has shown that if you're at ending population, your harvest population is 90,000, you're not going to lose any yield from having not enough population. I want to see that as my goal. I want to see like 100,000, 110,000. So I'd say rule of thumb is probably 140,000. It's planting per acre.
Sure.
And then that conveniently is, if you're still using paper bags, it's one paper bag per acre. But most people use boxes nowadays.
So as we talked about, maximizing the amount of days each soybean has, isn't that because that's how we get our nodes? What about our maturity? And this, I know, still ties into our seed selection here.
Sure. The nice thing nowadays is that yield is not necessarily as tied as tightly as to maturity as it used to be. If you planted a 1.5 per se, and then a 2.5 in the same farm, most of the time a 2.5 is going to provide more yield, just because it's longer growing season, has a more higher potential of putting more pods on. That's kind of changed nowadays, and it's kind of like corn. Corn used to have a pretty hard limit as to earlier varieties are just not going to do 200 bushels. Now early varieties do 250. They've kind of broken that restriction, and soybeans are the same way. But in regards to having increasing your chances of having high yields, I would still be leaning towards a full season maturity. The reason is that most of the time you're going to see a little bit more moisture late in August than having moisture early on in August.
And why is that important to us?
Because August rains make soybean yields. It's a very dominant part of the process. So having a variety that's still out trying to put pods on late in August, you should be taking advantage of some rains. Now, it's not guaranteed. I mean, sometimes if you have the early ones and you have a lot of moisture going early in August, then they have an advantage. And like in this area, for example, we've seen 1.5s dominate, and then we're in a solidly, I would say, 2.3 type of maturity zone. But for whatever reason, those years, those conditions, they took advantage of it. But overall, looking at the plot data, we're seeing probably a couple bushels more just by using a later planted maturity versus some of the earlier stuff.
Okay. I think I need a little bit more information here on why August's rains make or break soybean yields.
Well, that introduces the elephant in the room. We've talked about all the things we can do, and again, we actually have to talk about some other things we can do. But the problem is it's like you can do everything right, but the rain is always the ultimate factor in what your soybean yield is going to do. That's the problem with precision farming is like, you can make all your plans and put your little inputs, your limited inputs in the right areas, but when the rain comes or when the rain doesn't come is going to really be the overriding factor. So with soybeans, basically all you need to do is you need to get them as a plant to be alive, basically, when it gets to pod filling. They don't have to be pretty. They don't have to be tall. You just need to get them out of the ground, get them to the pod filling phase, and then pray for rain. And if you got a lot of rain, they will do well. If you have a lot of rain, then they're going to struggle. That rain just dominates. And I found that out the hard way. Well, no, it's going to be a fun and sad way. Let's put it that way. One year I took all our test plots. And then we also had some software it's called Climate. And with that software, they're tracking rain for those plots. And so I took all the rain that was in the soil to start with. Then I kept track of all the rain for each month. And at the end of the year, it's like, well, I'm going to look at the yields we got from those plots. And then based on what we have month-wise, and I thought, I'd figured this all out, that, we're going to see this huge correlation between having water and not having water. And I found out that is not the case whatsoever. You could start out droughty, having enough rain throughout this growing season didn't matter. It was really having rain in August that really pushed it over the edge.
And was there a certain time in August or not really?
Just when they're filling.
And that ties into our maturity talk earlier.
Yeah, because it's like the early stuff, it could be done when those late season rains come. They're not going to fill more pods.
Sure.
Whereas the late stuff at least has the potential to fill more pods.
Fair enough. That was very enlightening and classic farming with the always banking on the weather. But I guess one other topic I want to cover today is some of the unique ways we've been seeing to push the envelope for our yields. One other thing I want to cover here is spraying and fungicide, because I think that's an important input that we kind of breezed over a little bit and alluded to earlier.
Yes, we did. So we got to look at spraying for two things. One is for your weeds, and then one is for potentially fungicide spraying. Weeds, as a rule, and pretty sound science, is that weeds will compete. And so anytime you have weeds in your field, they're going to be competing for sunlight, and they're going to be competing for moisture and nutrients. So if you let them go, they're robbing yield. So I am pretty strong about eliminating weeds with extreme prejudice. We got a lot of different herbicides out there, a lot of good things to control. And so take care of the weeds. It doesn't really matter so much, but we have Roundup. Roundup still works for a lot of acres. 2,4-Ds out there now. Dicamba is off market right now, but it's probably going to be in market again. And again, that's a very strong weed control option. And then you have Liberty for some of the late season stuff. It's hard to put on, it can be finicky, but it does work. So eliminating weeds is a great system if you want to have strong yields. Fungicide. Fungicide can or cannot be important. A lot of people make fungicide as just kind of, we're going to do it every year. I'm not sure that you have to do it every year. For the guys in white mold prone areas, it's usually a very good thing to use fungicide. But you have to understand how to use a fungicide first. So white mold comes in through the flowers. And so nothing you do spraying before that happens is not going to be a positive, not going to help anything with it. So you have to spray with fungicide. You got to spray as soon as you start seeing the flowers and then that will keep the white mold out. Once the white mold is in the plant, no fungicide is going to touch it. So once it's established, it's in there. So then you're going to have to spray early on the first flower, and then you want to spray right as it starts pod filling, be a second treatment. And so that's your white mold treatment. I would say if you really want to cut corners or you want to save some money that potentially you could, it can be an economic benefit. If you don't have cool and wet conditions in late June, early July, you're probably not going to have white mold. That's what it needs for it to take over or to be a problem. So you can save yourself some money by not spraying fungicide under those conditions.
Sure.
Otherwise, you can spray the fungicide late in the season, and that is for other diseases. So this is, again, during pod fill. I think they want to call it F3 is the technical scientific term. That's for some of the late season diseases that not necessarily like the name brand diseases that you hear about, but some yield robbers as far as like that do some leaf damage.
So that's fungicide. So what about spraying our micronutrients?
So some people have pushed that, and I'm not a huge fan of that. There's two things working against that. One is that the soybean root mass is very compact. And so it's not going to be able to, if you band some of the stuff out later in the season, it's going to have a hard time getting to that root mass and be used. So it's just really hard to deliver anything to the root mass. And as far as delivering anything to the leaves, soybeans have a fairly strong waxy coating that they don't absorb things well. And so if you're trying to put nitrogen, other stuff into them, there's only a limited amount of stuff that they can absorb. And so really the only reason I see is maybe some delivery of some potential micronutrients. A good example is Michigan. They tend to have magnesium deficiencies in their soil. And here's a chance where you can spray that magnesium onto the leaves and they can absorb it because it's such a low level that they can handle that.
Huh. Interesting. Well, I think that kind of covers all of our bases. One of the last things I have is that I know there's some pretty interesting ways some guys have been pushing the envelope, and I'm curious to hear what those are and what you think of them.
Okay. So I do know a couple guys that are pushing, they really do everything they can to increase yield. And so we kind of talked about a lot of, let's kind of just review quick what we know are good things. So one is planting early. Planting early makes a huge difference as far as yield goes, usually about 4 bushels. And I guess we didn't cover it so as well as we should have. But, most people plant corn, get that in, and then they plant soybeans. And if you really want to maximize yield, you got to plant soybeans as early as possible. And if you do that, you have a higher potential for disease pressure. White mold tends to crop up, sudden death tends to crop up. And again, that's where variety selection, having tolerance to white mold, and then sudden death, tolerance to sudden death, and then actually seed treatment for both, or not for both, for sudden death is important. So if you're planting early, use seed treatment. That's a big one. Having the sulfur on, making sure you have the right amount of sulfur, having your inoculant on for the bacteria. And then having clean fields. What else do we cover? Having right conditions. So that's a good program. Controlling your weeds. That's a good program. So what are the guys doing that are outside the box?
Yep.
And that's kind of what we're talking about now. The big one I see is that guys are rolling their beans and or spraying them with some herbicides to send them back. And the theory is that you're going to go in there, beat those beans up, and then they will actually branch out because they got beat up. And then, so you have all of a sudden instead of one branch growing straight up, you have multiple branches. And each of those branches, every certain amount of days, is going to put another node on. And then those nodes, again, are potential yield areas. Mm-hmm. So once I heard that, I started like, all right, what does the university say? What's the data say? And they're like, no, it doesn't really work that way. But I disagree. And I'm going to tell you what. They're trying to do it year in, year out. They've done different rates, different times. And when you look at over time, it's not always going to work out.
Because you're running a lot of risk.
Yes. Well, here's the downside to rolling. So rolling is just, you're going through a field. They used to do it more to smooth the field out so the combines would go through easier. The guys that are pushing yields, they're waiting for the plant to get up. They're kind of trying to beat it up. Usually a pop can size is what I was told is the ideal size. The downside would be you potentially can damage more plants than you kill more plants by doing that than actually beating them up enough to make them do more nodes or more branches. It's another trip through the field. It's more cost. Spraying cobra is the other thing. Again, they'll put the beans back. And I think the benefit for the herbicide portion is that I think you actually set the beans back more than make a branch. And then, again, a little longer growing season, hopefully get to the late August rains. So research-wise, they can't seem to repeat it enough or get enough response. And I think the guys that do it successfully are doing it. They know when to do it, how to do it, and they figured it out.
It's an art and a science there.
It's more art. Yeah, there's some art there, not just, basic science. So if you're going to do it, it's potentially a benefit, but there's some downside and there's a lot of risk. And the other thing is even if you do that, you're not always going to get the response because, again, moisture.
Sure.
Yeah, you can have more nodes, and what's going to happen is you run out of moisture. The nodes aren't going to fill. You're not going to have 3 beans in every pod. You're not going to have a lot of pods on each node. Moisture is the limiting factor. That's really the things that they do that I think stand out as far as what we haven't talked about is trying to beat that plant up and, either delay it or add more branches onto the plant.
And that wraps up another episode of Renk Seeds of Innovation. A big thanks to Alex for sharing his insight on everything from soil fertility and seed treatments to soybean maturity, planting windows, and how August rains can make or break your yield. Maximizing soybean yield starts with prevention, stopping what's robbing your crop before trying to add more. The right genetics matter too. Strong disease tolerance can mean a 15 to 20 bushel difference, and early planting pays off if you're managing for white mold and sudden death. At the end of the day, innovation doesn't always follow the research. It's part science, part art, and almost always dependent on Mother Nature. Be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss future episodes, and follow Renk Seed on social media for more agronomic tips and updates. Until next time, I'm your host, Max Renk, and this has been the Renk Seeds of Innovation podcast.
Be sure to hit subscribe for a notification when a new episode drops each month, and follow Renk on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and X. This has been the Renk Seeds of Innovation podcast, innovating agriculture one seed at a time.